Good day. My name is Robert Senkewicz. I am Professor of History Emeritus at Santa Clara University. And the background I have behind me is, in fact, the campus of Santa Clara University, which is a campus which contains one of the missions that was founded by the subject of my talk, who is Father Junipero Serra. And there we go. The subject of our talk is Father Serra, the man behind the myths. As you all know, Father Serra has been the subject of many activities and actions in various locations over the last couple of months. And this talk is basically, I think, a way to try to get behind the actions, the day-to-day actions, and look at the man himself. I'd like to thank the Napa Institute for inviting me to do this, and Kathleen O'Reilly for organizing this presentation. Any technical glitches are mine, not hers. So let's start. It's always easy to start not with complexity, but with simplicity. So let's start with simple myths. One myth that surrounds Father Serra was started by this woman, unintentionally, but nevertheless really, Helen Hunt Jackson, who in the mid 1880s published a very famous book called Ramona. Jackson was hoping that Ramona would be a book which would lay bare the way in which the U.S. had mistreated the indigenous peoples. Instead, the book was read as a romanticization of the California missions, and it set in motion the movement which in California blossoms in the late 19th and early 20th century called the Spanish Revival movement. And everybody in California gets involved in this movement. It starts in Southern California, but spreads throughout the state. It spreads throughout the state partially because of the work of the Automobile Club of Southern California, who wanted to encourage tourism, which you'd have to drive to. And one of the tourism journeys that they encouraged people to take was the journey to all of the missions. And the Automobile Club put these bells up on the alleged historic El Camino Real on Highway 101 in California. Many of you have probably driven by these bells. Frank Miller in Riverside built the Mission Inn, a tremendously kitschy place with mission things galore, but he's attempting to take advantage of mission tourism. And as part of this mission revival, the Spanish revival movement, Father Serra becomes kind of the symbol of everything that happened during the mission era, even though he only was there for the first 15 years of a 60-year mission era. And a number of statues are put up in California commemorating him. This particular statue is in Monterey, and it was put up and funded, ironically, by Mrs. Jane Stanford. I say ironically because of Stanford University has recently taken Serra's name off of a number of campus streets and landmarks. This was in Monterey. Another statue was put up in Golden Gate Park, and this was a statue that, as a number of you know, were vandalized and torn down a month or so ago. It was funded by former San Francisco Mayor James Phelan. So Serra, in this version of the myth, is a faultless, selfless hero who basically civilizes the California native peoples. Well, the other side of the myth really starts around right after World War II, when Kerry McWilliams, and he builds on a couple of other things that have been done earlier, but he seizes on, is right after World War II, and he seizes on the analogy of concentration camps in his book, Southern California Country. And this analogy, along with the associated phenomenon of genocide, becomes a way in which the counter myth really develops. So by the time you get to the 1980s, when Pope John Paul II is in the process of the final stages of beatifying Serra, a book like this, The Missions of California, A Legacy of Genocide, appears. And in connection with Pope Francis's canonization of Serra 5 years ago, you even get a Facebook group, Say No to Sainthood, about Father Serra. And in this version of the myth, Serra is not the faultless hero, but he is the grisly architect of death, destruction, and in some more extreme cases, genocide of the California native peoples. These myths are 180 degrees apart from each other. They're almost mirror images of each other. But myths are simple. Humanity is a little bit more complicated. I think a good way to begin talking about Father Serra is to read a letter that he wrote in 1775. He had just learned that Mission San Diego had been destroyed in an attack by local Kumeyaay people, and that one of the resident missionaries at San Diego, Father Luis Jaime, had been killed. 2 days later, Serra writes a letter to the Viceroy in Mexico City, whom he had personally met a few years earlier. And this is what he says. One of the most important things that I requested at the beginning of these conquests was that if the Indians were to kill me, whether they be Gentiles or Christians, they should be forgiven. And now I make the same request of you. If they, the Indians, have already killed the missionary, what are we to gain with military campaigns? Let the murderer live so he can be saved, which is the purpose of our coming here and the reason for forgiving him. Help him to understand with some moderate punishment that he is being pardoned in accordance with our laws, which order us to forgive offenses and to prepare him not for his death, but for eternal life. That letter, I think, is a good way to get into what Father Serra's missionary life was about. If I'm killed, don't kill the person who killed me. Serra was born on the island of Majorca in 1713. He grew up in a small agricultural village on the eastern half of the island called Petra. He attended grammar school in the church on the left, San Bernardino. The church was run by the Franciscans, and at the age of 16, Serra entered the Franciscan order. He goes to Palma, which is in the capital of Majorca, which is in the bay on the lower left of the island there, and enters the novitiate slightly outside of the city. At the end of his novitiate, he takes his vows, and then he does something very strange. He changes his name. His baptismal name had been Miguel Serra, but he changes his name to Junipero in honor of Brother Junipero, one of the original companions of St. Francis of Assisi. And I think what's going on here is that, even as a teenager, Serra knew himself well enough to know that the virtues for which Brother Junipero was celebrated in the Franciscan tradition, namely humility and patience, these were virtues that Serra was going to have a hard time realizing in his own life. And he realized that he's going to need a little bit of heavenly help from Brother Junipero to attain these virtues. So he has a very, very good self-knowledge, I think, from a pretty early age. He's ordained a priest. After his ordination, he goes into advanced studies in theology. He becomes an expert on John Duns Scotus, and he becomes a very, very well-known teacher and preacher. He's working at the Franciscan University in Palma, and he preaches all over the island. He is a very, very successful guy in Palma. But at the end of the 1740s, he volunteers to go to the missions in America. He never tells us why, but my suspicion is that, he's saying to himself, he's 35 years old, midlife. Is this what I was ordained for? Isn't there more that I can do? He's very much influenced by a Majorcan figure. This is where he's living, in the patio of the Convento of San Francisco in Palma. This is what it looks like now. And this is the church that he goes to, right next to the convent, Church of San Francisco. Interestingly enough, the statue of Serra, which is in front of this church where I took this picture a number of years ago, is one of the statues that was vandalized within the last month or so. But inside that church is the tomb of Ramon Llull, a member of the Third Order of St. Francis, who a century before had gone to North Africa and missionized among the Muslim people there, and was buried then, returned and is buried there in that church. Sarah walked by this tomb every day, and of course, in the Franciscan tradition itself, Saint Francis uh, and his encounter with the Sultan in Egypt, the missionary activity is kind of written into the DNA of the Franciscan order. And Serra volunteers to go to the New World. And when he goes into the New World, he enters the world of Spanish colonialism. Now, colonialism is one of those dirty words nowadays, and none of us would sit down and want to recreate it. But it's often enough treated, as if all colonialism from Canada all the way down to Tierra del Fuego was exactly the same, and that's simply not the case, not the case at all. This picture tells us something very important. This was taken in 2015 at the North American College, where the college had a seminar on Serra right after the Pope had said that he was going to canonize him in his visit to the States. And what's happening in this picture is that Archbishop Gomez of Los Angeles on the right has just given the Pope a relic of Father Serra, and the Pope is venerating the relic. The important thing about this picture is that both of these bishops were born in Latin America. The Pope, of course, in Argentina, and Archbishop Gomez was born in Monterrey, Mexico. And that's really, really important because at this time, the California that Serra was going to be working in was not part of what we now think of as North America. The California that Serra was working in was part of Latin America. You can see from this map of North America in 1763. And to really understand what's going on, you have to understand not colonialism in general, or not what we understand, in the U.S. as British colonialism. You have to understand Spanish colonialism. And it's a little different from British colonialism. British colonialism's attitude toward the indigenous people was pretty clear. Push them west or kill them. And this started in 1637 with the famous Mystic Fort Massacre, where the Puritans killed over 400 Pequots at the Mystic River. And William Bradford, the author of Plymouth Plantation, says that the burning of their bodies was like a sweet sacrifice up to God. Pretty gruesome kind of thing. Well, in Latin America, it's somewhat different. There were cruelties against the indigenous people. That's absolutely true. But those cruelties were challenged, and they were challenged from a very, very early age. In 1511, Dominican Antonio de Montesinos, the first Sunday of Advent, in Santo Domingo, gave a sermon. The first Sunday of Advent is John the Baptist and the voice crying in the wilderness. And he said, "I'm a voice crying in the wilderness, and this is what he's crying. This is what my voice is crying." And the congregation is filled with conquistadores and landowners. "You are in mortal sin, and live and die therein by reason of the cruelty and tyranny that you practice on these innocent people. Tell me, by what right or justice do you hold these Indians in such cruel and horrible slavery?" And Montesinos was one of the people who influenced Bartolome de las Casas, whose activity both in the New World and in Spain led Spain to pass a number of laws, the so-called New Laws, and other laws which attempted to regulate the treatment of the Indians in a better kind of way. But Las Casas, ironically, also becomes kind of the author, because of his book, which is translated into a variety of languages. He becomes the unwitting author of what's known as the Black Legend, the notion that Spain's treatment of the indigenous peoples in the Americas was uniquely cruel. And this is an English version of that book that was done in 1656. A German version, which was published at the end of the 1500s, had illustrations by Theodor de Brie, a Dutch illustrator, and these illustrations are gruesome, describing the Spanish treatment of the indigenous people. And it's these illustrations that really caused the Black Legend to spread all throughout Europe. This particular illustration is taken from an actual episode in Las Casas' book where this Indian who's being burned at the stake, whose name was Hatui, he was the leader of a rebellion. And as right before he is being executed, the friar comes up to him and says, "Would you like to be baptized?" And he says, "Well, why would I want to be baptized?" And the friar says, "Well, so you can go to heaven." And the Indian says, "Well, are there Christians in heaven?" And the friar says, "Oh yeah, there are loads of Christians in heaven." And the Indian says, "Well, I don't want to go there then." And of course, in the theology of the day, that absolutely appalled Las Casas, because the man was condemning himself to hell. And so what happens is that because of Las Casas and because of the treatment of the Indians by encomenderos, hacienda owners, and mine owners, I mean, the Indians were working the silver mines to death. From 1500 to 1800, roughly 15,000 Spanish clerics leave Spain and go to become missionaries in the New World. This is the most famous mission in the United States. Most people don't know it's a mission, the Alamo, but its actual formal name is San Antonio de Valero. But missions were all over the place. There's a mission that's in present-day Louisiana, the mission in San Francisco, where Mission Dolores is now. Some of you have probably been to this great mission, San Javier del Bac in Tucson. And this map shows you how many missions there were. This is in northern Mexico. Missions were all over the place. And what the missionaries were trying to do was gather the Indians together to protect them from the ravages and the oppressions of the conquistadores and their successors on the haciendas and the silver mines. The missionaries deeply believed that without them, the Indians would be oppressed and worked to death. Well, Serra joins that missionary activity. He gets to, in January 1st, 1750, he arrives at the Franciscan missionary headquarters in Mexico City, the Colegio de San Fernando. Interestingly enough, the day before that, on December 31st, 1749, he prays at the shrine of Our Lady of Guadalupe, the Brown Virgin. And he begins to get a sense of the kind of the syncretistic nature of popular Mexican Catholicism. And that syncretistic nature, as we'll see, is very, very important in his missionary activity. He spends 8 years working at these missions in the Sierra Gorda, about 200 miles north of Mexico City. And then he spends the next 8 years giving domestic missions throughout various parts of Mexico. And these are places where we know he preached in Mexico. He was a member of what we would now call, at least when I was growing up at our parish, every couple of years, I think they were redemptorists. They would come by and give missions at our church in New York at St. Columba. And, they would try to revivify our fervor, and there would be processions and benedictions and confessions and everything like that. And that's what Serra did. And he begins to interact with indigenous people. In the Sierra Gorda, he interacts with the Pame people in Baja California with 3 groups. And when he gets to Alta California, the most significant interactions he has are with the Kumeyaay in San Diego and with the Ohlone in the Bay Area. But while he's in Mexico, he spends actually more time in Mexico than he does in California. While he's in Mexico, he begins to get a good sense of popular Mexican piety. And he begins to get a good sense of the mix of indigenous and imported elements of Spanish Catholicism. And it begins to get a sense of the caste system. At one point, he's involved in an Inquisition case where one woman accuses another woman of being a witch. And one woman is a mulata and the other woman is a loba. So he gets a good sense of the way in which traditional indigenous religion is influencing the way in which Catholicism in New Spain is being interpreted and done. And you can see that from here. This is a picture of a church in Hidalgo, Mexico, and on the wall of the church, you have a jaguar warrior, an Aztec figure, decorating the walls of the Catholic Church. So Mexican religion, especially popular then as it developed, especially in California and in the northern frontier areas, is very much a mixed kind of religion. And we have a sense, this is a picture of Mission Carmel taken drawn 2 years after Father Serra died. We do have a sense of Serra's interest in this. In one of his letters, he talks about talking with an Ohlone person whom he had baptized. And these are all Ohlone Indians lined up, and they're welcoming French visitor. But his name was Juan Evangelista, and Serra had baptized him. And Serra records a conversation that he had with Juan. He says, I asked Juan if and when his people saw us, if they had ever imagined such a land where everybody wore clothes. Juan said no. They believed all lands to be like theirs. And with respect to the soldiers and the padres, after they had taken a hard, long look at them, they believed them to be the sons of the mules that were carrying them. I replied that according to that belief, he and his people probably imagined that there were lands where mules gave birth to men and clothing. And Juan said no, but rather the elders said that they had come out from under the ground and that they were the souls, in their way of understanding, of the ancestors from that area who had reappeared in that manner. So you see what's happening? Serra is trying to find out what the beliefs of these people are so that he can figure out a way to preach the gospel to these people in a way that most accommodates their own religious beliefs. He's not going around preaching about the Immaculate Conception to people. He's trying to find out where they are and trying then to use where they are to introduce them to the gospel. And this is a great picture. This is the picture of Petaluma Indians in front of Mission Dolores here in San Francisco. And these Petaluma Indians have just agreed to enter the mission system. And what they are probably doing is they are probably purifying the land and the ground and the site before they enter. So it gives you a real good sense of the way in which the missions were very much places not only of Spanish Catholicism, but of indigenous spirituality. And they kind of kept that all the way through. In fact, this picture was so good that Rosemary and I used it as a cover picture of our book on Father Serra, because it gives a great illustration of what California missions actually were, that they were overwhelmingly, in terms of the population, indigenous communities. When Serra goes up from Baja California, where he had been assigned after the Jesuits had been expelled, to San Diego, he keeps a long diary, and you can see how excited he is to get to San Diego. There's his diary, but then he's got a line right by itself: Puerto de San Diego, gracias a Dios, the port of San Diego. Thanks be to God. He is just so excited to get into a new territory populated by Gentiles, as he called them, so that he could evangelize and preach the gospel to them. During the time that he was in California, he founded 10 missions. One of those missions, the one at the bottom there, San Fernando de Velicata, is in Baja California, and he founded that on his way with Gaspar de Portola up to San Diego first, and then to Monterey. But during the time that he was president, 9 missions from San Francisco in the north to San Diego in the south were founded. We don't know exactly what the founding of Monterey itself looks like, but we can be absolutely 100% sure that it did not look anything like this picture, which is a picture kind of in the beginning of the Spanish Revival period. But that's a good way to introduce us into what Serra's mission strategy was. And we can get a sense of that mission strategy from a group of sermons. We only have 4 sermons, the text of 4 sermons that he gave, and they're all from Palma, where he gave the sermons to a group of Poor Clares, a group of Lenten sermons. And for these sermons, this is in 1744, for these sermons, he took as his overall theme Psalm 33, a verse from Psalm 33, taste and see that the Lord is good. And this is what he says: anyone who has tasted the sweetness of the Lord just once regards as empty all of this life's pleasures and delights. But someone who has tried it just once discovers that he has an increasing appetite for it, for he finds it very soothing. As the Lord himself says, those who eat of me will hunger for more, and those who thirst for me, those who drink of me will thirst for more. That's that's kind of what turned out to be his missionary strategy. God is a delight, and what the job of the missionary is to model that delight so that people are spontaneously attracted to it and they want to taste and see the goodness of the Lord. And you get a sense of this. This is Monterey, uh, and this is, you can see on the top where the Presidio was founded. Within a year, Serra moved the mission from Monterey down to the banks of the Carmel River. And the reason that he did that, he says, he writes this letter 2 weeks after the Presidio was founded, and he already realizes the Presidio ain't the place for a church. And the reason is what he says in this letter: there is no Indian village at all in the vicinity of this port. Because of this, if we see that they are determined to accept our holy faith, we need to recognize the special difficulty they will have in taking up residence here. It might be necessary to leave the Presidio and, with a few soldiers of the escort, move the mission close to the Carmel River. Why close to the Carmel River? Because, as you can see on the map, that's where the Indians were. What he wants the mission to be is a place where the mission community, in witnessing to the goodness of God, can invite the native peoples to come in and taste and see that goodness. And that's what he tried to do in Carmel. But of course, there is another side to the missions, and the other side is, like 99.9% of the people in Europe at the time, Serra and most of the missionaries believed that Europeans were superior to the indigenous peoples of the Americas. And so their attitude towards them was a paternalism. It was a paternalism that they believed was a benign paternalism, but that definitely was paternalism, the superior people taking care of and trying to help the inferior people move along. You get a sense of that from another sermon that he gave in Palma, and he's talking about the love of God the Father. And he says this: you will say, how can the tender love of a father for his child be reconciled with punishing and afflicting him? Well, actually, a harmony between love and strictness is what characterizes a true father. It is precisely because the father loves him that he teaches him to obey. When he misbehaves, the father scolds and punishes him so that the son can correct his mistakes. The Divine Father behaves in a similar way with men who are his own sons. And at the missions, when Indians misbehaved, they were punished. They were punished generally with whipping. And the major form of misbehaving was either leaving the missions. I think it must be admitted that the missionaries, Serra included, didn't do a great job of telling people when they were going to be baptized that, as far as the church is concerned, baptism is a lifetime commitment. So some guys are being baptized just to be polite. And then they figure, okay, that's fine, now I can go back home. And they find out that they're not allowed to go back home. Other people are allowed to go back home for a certain amount of time, and some of them don't return on time. Soldiers are usually sent out to get them, and if they are captured, they are brought back and they are whipped. And in one letter to the military commander, this is what Serra says: last Friday, I sent 7 adults to the mountains in search of my lost sheep, Indians who had run away. Last night, they brought back to me 9 neophytes from this mission. I am sending 4 of them to you for punishment, a period of time in exile, and 2 or 3 rounds of whipping. This should be a good lesson for them as well as for the others. If you do not have shackles on hand over there at the Presidio, let me know. They can be sent from here. So the missions were places of punishment as well. And the missionaries thought that they were doing this in a paternalistic way. It's very doubtful that the Indians saw themselves as children. but the punishment was meant to be um, severe. Some writers have thought, well, Serra, of course, used the discipline like most religious back there did. But Serra himself had to, he wrote in some letters, he had to try to justify this because even he realized that this was not exactly what a true father ought to be doing. And in one letter, he kind of appeals to a story that was prevalent in Franciscan circles that Hernan Cortez, the conquistador of Mexico, when Indians were late for mass, they would be whipped, and they were complaining. And Cortez, to convince the Indians that that this punishment would be equally given to everybody, volunteered to the priest that I'll be late for mass next Sunday, and you can whip me. Now, whether the story is true or not, it becomes a Franciscan story. But the fact that Serra himself has to appeal to that story shows that he himself was concerned about this whipping. And of course, nowadays, um, um, it is widely condemned. Archbishop Gomez, in a pastoral letter that he wrote about a month ago, wrote to his diocese, the archdiocese, with regret. And this is what he said. He said, "It is sadly true that corporal punishment was sometimes used in the missions." Well, what happened, and flogging, of course, as you know, was widely done. Serra had huge fights with soldiers, and he had huge fights with people in the pueblos that the governor founded, the Pueblo of San Jose and the Pueblo of Los Angeles. Now, remember, the missionaries always thought that they were protecting the Indians from the oppression that settlers and colonists would give them. Well, as it turned out in California, 50 years after his death, Serra's fears did in fact come true. When the missions were secularized in the 1830s, even though the missionaries insisted to the end of their rule over the missions that the land actually belonged to the Indians, that they were holding it in trust to the Indians, when the missions were secularized, the mission lands were divided up into ranchos, and the ranchos were distributed to the leading families of California. And time and again, there are, the rancheros didn't keep accurate records like the missionaries did, so you don't know how many workers they had on their ranchos. But there are enough episodes that are documented of rancheros sending out expeditions into the Central Valley or to Northern California to round up Indians, to bring them back and to force them to work on the ranchos. So Serra's fear and the missionaries' fear of 300 years earlier proves still to be an accurate kind of fear in California. So Serra himself dies in 1784. This is a very famous picture that was drawn in Mexico of his good friend, the founder of Mission Dolores, Father Francisco Palou, giving Serra the viaticum the day before he died. He was buried on the gospel side, and as you know, if you've been to Carmel, the grave of Father Serra, which he's been dug up a couple of times, and that's where a number of these relics come from. But that is still there. Serra was a man who basically, he lived in a time which none of us would want to recreate, the time of European expansion and Spanish colonialism. But within that time, I think it must be admitted that the man, as opposed to the myths, the man was a man who tried to make that system as humane and as equitable as he possibly could. Serra, like all of us, was a man who was composed of light and darkness, but he took that situation and he tried to stand for justice rather than for cruelty, and he tried to stand in theological terms for grace rather than sin. So, thank you all very much. I hope that the virtual conference goes very well, and I really appreciate your attention during my talk on Saint